Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Mary Alice Wilderson, not a native, but I'm here to make a special announcement to everyone this evening. The KILRUSH Genealogical Conference 2026, from the Great Famine to the 1926 Census. Save the date, the 9th to the 11th of October 2026. Confirmed speakers are Kira Brennock from UCC, Katrina Crow, Fiona Fitzsimons from Trinity College, Morris Gleason, John Grenham, Rachel Murphy from UL, and there will also be representatives from the National Archives of Ireland to discuss the release of the 1926 Irish Census. All lectures will focus on different aspects of the 1926 census data, including its connection to social history, previous censuses, other genealogical data sets, and DNA. Topics may evolve as our speakers become familiar with the newly released census data between April and October. A full auxiliary program of tours and social events is being organized for the conference weekend. More information, including booking details, will be available early in the new year. Again, those dates are the 9th to the 11th of October, 2026. Save the date. Thank you. And I'll hand it over to Paddy Waldron, this evening's speaker.
Thank you very much, Mary Alice. Thank you all very much for coming. I was supposed to do this with our secretary, Paul O'Brien. Paul and myself and his colleague, Richard McMahon in Mary Immaculate College, have been studying John Jackson since about 2019. And we had a deadline at the end of last year for a book chapter, which is due out in December of this year. So we said we'd talk a little bit tonight about John Jackson's background in Kilrush. Most of you have probably never heard of him. By the end of the next hour, I hope you'll know a lot more about him. Paul can't be with us tonight and sends his apologies. So the first half of this was supposed to be my half and will be probably a lot more than half. And the last half, which was supposed to be Paul's half, will be a bit shorter. I have put these notes on my own website. So if you want to take one note, just write down that address, pwaldron.info/Jackson/Kilrush. And I'm trying to do 10 jobs at once today. And there are 12 people watching us on YouTube. And I forgot to share my screen to YouTube, which I will now do for our YouTube listeners. And they were now seeing 2 copies of me, one called Mary Alice. So I will take the second webcam off YouTube, and hopefully you can still hear me if you're listening on YouTube. Hopefully my audio is working. Aileen, who's monitoring things remotely on YouTube, will put a message up there if I've turned the audio off by accident or anything. So I was supposed to just talk about Jackson's Kilrush years. I'll be talking about his Dublin years a little bit. Can you all read that on the screen, or do you want it a bit bigger? Mary Alice, can you see that down the back? He was baptized not in this building, but in the old church, which is now a ruin out the back. I'll talk about what we know about his parents. I'll talk about where the Jacksons are buried. I'll talk about his family tree. I'll talk about where the Jacksons lived in Kilrush. I'll talk about his school days, the Kilrush reading room, which Paul only discovered last weekend, and his pseudonyms. John Jackson was better known in his lifetime by 2 pseudonyms. In his earlier years, he wrote as Andrew or Andy Marinan, and in his later years, he wrote as Terry Driscoll. He rarely wrote under his real name. And I will read extracts from his writing as we go on. So he was presumably born here in Kilrush. He was baptized here in Kilrush. I have a copy of the baptismal record, John Jackson's baptism. The registers for this church and for the church out the back, which preceded it, have survived. They've been in the representative church body library in Dublin for many years, and they're now available on microfilm in the local study centre in Ennis. So I was able to go to Ennis earlier in the year and find the baptism entry. When John Jackson died, he was reported in 1857 to be 45 years of age. So his birth year in a lot of sources is 1812, in some it's 1810, but he was baptized back here in 1809 on the 25th of September. So that says 1809, September 25th, John, the son of Captain Jackson of the Clare Militia. So we know what his father did for a living. He was a professional soldier, baptized by the Reverend I. Whitty. Irwin Whitty was the rector in this church and in the previous church for many decades. He's buried in a big Whitty plot out the back here. But this isn't the rector of Kilrush. This is his son, Irwin Whitty Jr. of Cashel, who was actually murdered in Cashel in 1832, probably during the Tide Wars, if I remember correctly. So we know we're talking about a man baptized and almost certainly born in Kilrush. I say almost certainly because his father was a soldier in the Clare Militia, and the militia moved around the country, and their wives and children travelled with them. So there's a small possibility he was born somewhere else where his father was stationed and not baptized until they came home to Kilrush. He was a journalist primarily. Most of his writing is in newspapers. Some of it is news reporting. Some of it is possibly masquerading as news reporting, but with a little bit of fiction thrown in. He wrote poetry, he wrote satire, he wrote short stories, and more. So I like to introduce him to people by saying Terry Driscoll was to the Irish newspapers of the 19th century as Flann O'Brien, who you probably all heard of, was to the Irish newspapers of the 20th century, or Ross O'Carroll Kelly in the 21st century. All of them tried to convey the Irish vernacular, the Hiberno English that we speak in this country, in exaggerated terms. Or maybe Ross O'Carroll Kelly isn't Hiberno English, maybe it's Anglo-Dublinese or something, but they wrote in a strange phonetic type of way. Jackson started his career while he lived in Kilrush. He moved to Dublin in 1842. He was associated with a lot of the famous 19th century Irish writers. Gerald Griffin, who wrote the Collegians, the story based on the Colleen Bawn, was a little older than John Jackson. Gerald Griffin's mother was a Geary from Limerick, and the Gearys were in the newspaper business in Limerick, and Jackson wrote for the Gearys newspapers in Limerick. Sheridan Le Fanu was of a similar class to Jackson. He was the son of a Protestant clergyman who started life in Dublin, and then they were moved down to Abington in County Limerick. And Le Fanu, as well as being a novelist, wrote Gothic novels, a dozen or more of them, was also involved in newspapers as an editor and as a journalist. And at the end of John Jackson's life, Le Fanu employed Jackson to write for his newspaper, The Warder. There's an annual festival in Abington, the Le Fanu Festival, every year. It's coming up on Saturday week. So I'll be talking about Sheridan and Le Fanu, about Jackson and Le Fanu at that festival. And the other noted novelist who he knew was Charles Lever, again, a couple of years older than him. And Lever also lived here in Kilrush. He wasn't from Kilrush. He was a medical doctor. And during the cholera epidemic in 1832, Lever was sent to Kilrush, possibly for only a few months, to minister to the cholera victims at a special cholera hospital here in Kilrush. And he may have known Jackson already, but they certainly spent a lot of time together. And he later became the editor of the Dublin University magazine, and he published Jackson's work in that. And we'll come across him again later in the talk. So hopefully by the end of this talk, you'll agree with Paul and Richard and myself that Jackson deserves to be better remembered than he is. I've shown you the baptism record, a little bit of background on how his parents met. The end of the 1800s saw the French Revolution. The storming of the Bastille was in 1789. In 1791, the United Irishmen were established in Belfast. In February 1793, there was a declaration of war by France against Great Britain. It was before the Act of Union, so Ireland wasn't involved, but the authorities on both sides of the Irish Sea feared a French invasion coming from Ireland. So the various county militias for all the counties of Ireland were set up after that declaration of war. In May 1793, the Clare Militia was formed. John Jackson II, we'll call him. Our subject, the writer, was the third consecutive generation to be called John Jackson. So I'll call his father Captain John usually, and we know very little about the grandfather. He's listed in July as an ensign, a lower ranking officer in the first list of officers of the Clare Militia. We know the militia were moved around the country. They were in Drogheda later that year. Then in 1797, they were in Enniscorthy. And the heartland of the United Irish Rebellion in 1798 was down in the southeast, mostly in Wexford. So the Clare Militia stayed down in that part of the country. They were in Waterford in 1798. They were across the river in South Wexford in New Ross for the Battle of New Ross on the 5th of June, 1798. So Captain John Jackson was fighting against the United Irishmen in Wexford. But he had other things on his mind while he was in Waterford. He met a young lady called Alice Rogers. And we know that their marriage license bond was issued in 1798 or registered in 1798. There is an index that has survived from the Public Record Office in Dublin. Not sure was this index in the Public Record Office, where there was a great fireproof barrier to protect the archives from a fire that might break out in the reading room in 1922. Unfortunately, the fire broke out in the archive part, and the reading room was spared by the fireproof barrier. So the indexes like this were probably in the reading room. The original marriage license bonds were on the other side, and they went up in smoke. So we have Jackson John and Alice Rogers, 1798, in that index. We don't know what date of the year or what parish they married in, but it was somewhere down in the southeast. And her cousin had married the Dr. Castle, who was also with the Clare Militia, the medical officer of the militia. So two of the soldiers married Waterford women and brought them back to Clare. So we have a long tradition of Waterford people migrating to Kilrush. There's one of them probably out still manning the desk, and another one on our committee, hopefully watching us on YouTube. So you're following in distinguished footsteps. So just to put it in context, 1800 then was the Act of Union. There were petitions in favor of and against the Union, and one of those petitions has two Jackson signatures, John Jackson and Robert Jackson, for the captain and his brother. Or maybe he wasn't the captain, or maybe he became a captain because he expressed his support for the Union. In November of 1800, he was promoted to captain. And 11 days after that, things changed in Kilrush because the local landlord, John Ormsby Vandeleur, married Frances Moore. We had no Frances Street and no Moore Street at this stage. They took their names from Frances Moore when she came to Kilrush, and John Ormsby is commemorated over here on my left in a fine monument, which I'll talk about again in a minute. So our John was born here. His parents are buried at the southeast corner. No, it's the southwest corner down there. The southwest corner is the old church. His uncle, Bob, as I'll call him, is buried at the southeast corner. And I went down there when I got here this afternoon to look at Uncle Bob's grave. And it's in a very sorry state. Sorry, I should blow that up so you can see it. The whole thing has collapsed. George Harrett and his team transcribed the tombstones here back in the 1980s. So we do have a pretty good idea of what the inscription that's buried down there says. I could just read the biblical verse at the bottom of it this afternoon. When we resurveyed the graveyard some years ago with historic graves, I don't think we managed to make out anything on that. But Uncle Bob has a very fine obituary, or epitaph, I should say. He challenged his nephew John, the writer, at one stage here in Kilrush to write his epitaph. And John came back within an hour and said, "How about this, Uncle Bob? Stop, stranger. This spot should possess some attraction, for beneath it is buried the bones of Bob Jackson. A more singular compound was ne'er put together. He could talk in all companies, walk in all weather. He loved dearly his pipe, his glass, and his daughter. He dreaded grim death and hated cold water. Minded everyone's business, neglected his own, and his dutiful nephew erected this stone." So I thought this afternoon, wouldn't it be a nice tribute to John Jackson if we could repair that collapsed vault and finally give Uncle Bob the obituary that his nephew composed, the epitaph that his nephew composed for him during his life. So we have those two graves, John and Alice, we did find during our historic graves, and it was kind of a little bit scruffy today because all the dead grass was on top of it, but it's still more or less legible. Sacred to the memory of John Jackson, late captain of the Clare Regiment, who departed in 1822. So John was only 12 when his father died, and of Alice, his wife, who died 14th December 1859. So she lived on as a widow for 37 years, and she outlived her son, John. Oops, what's going on here? But John does have a monument in Mount Jerome in Dublin, where he was buried. As I said, he moved to Dublin later in life. And you can see a picture of it on findagrave.com. I thought the whole thing was there. I just took this in at the last minute because Paul was supposed to talk about this bit. But the intriguing thing is a subscription was taken up after his death. He was that popular that there was a public collection to build a fine monument for him. Sorry that I don't have the image of it. And Joseph Robinson Kirk was commissioned to create the monument. And Joseph's father, Thomas Kirk, you've been looking at his name over there on the bottom right of the Vandeleur Memorial for years. He created that memorial. So John Jackson, I'm sure, worshipped here in this church. It was built in 1813. He started in 1813. He would have been 4 years of age. And John Ormsby died, what year? I can't remember now. Can somebody read it over there? 1828. So John Jackson would have been 19. So he was still worshipping here probably when that went up around 1830. Little thinking that the sculptor's son would be doing his monument 30 years on. So we'll switch over now to the family tree. This is my genealogy software to show you how little we really know about John Jackson's ancestors. His father was Captain John. His grandfather was another John, who must have lived in Kilrush because all his children lived in Kilrush. He could have come here from somewhere else. We don't know. The Rogers family, for a long while, I thought I would never figure out what was Alice's maiden surname. But I found it within the last year or so. And I was able to trace her family quite a way back, especially on her mother's side, the Morris side. They were a very distinguished family in the southeast. As you can see, there were two aldermen, Adam Rogers and Benjamin Morris, her father and her grandfather, aldermen of Waterford City. But the Rogers estate was in a townland called Bowderrin, if that's the right pronunciation, across the river in South Wexford. And if I go up here, we can look at the descendants of John Jackson, because he had some fairly important cousins. I don't see Yvonne McGann here, who often comes, but Yvonne gave us a great talk in Kilkee a year or two ago, about Captain Charles Fitzgerald. Born in Kilkee, joined the Royal Navy, ended his career as the Governor of Western Australia, retired back to Kilkee, where he lived into his 90s, commemorated by a monument in the old Protestant church in Kilkee, which is now a private residence. That's the biggest and finest monument you might see in a church. Fitzgerald's had this distinction of probably being the smallest monument in any church to any important figure. Robert Fitzgerald, and these are the first cousins of John the writer. They're the sons of his aunt Lucinda, who married Robert Fitzgerald. Robert Jr., John Jackson's other first cousin. You're familiar with his name probably, because you've probably all walked along Geraldine Place in Kilkee. He was a property developer in Kilkee. He built Geraldine Place, and because his name was Fitzgerald, he called it Geraldine Place. And he also built a house outside Kilkee called Desmond Villa, because he claimed his Fitzgeralds were the descendants of the Earls of Desmond, who were Fitzgeralds. This is Uncle Bob, whose collapsed vault I just showed you. He had one son and 4 daughters, and there's no mention of the son, James, after his baptism, so I suspect he died as an infant. But the 4 daughters don't seem to have ever married, and some of them lived in Kilrush all their lives. We'll come to one of those again later. This is Captain John. John the writer had a sister, Alice, who married a widower, Richard Trousdale, from Fort House in Ballynote or Kappa, just outside the town here. John's eldest brother, Benjamin, joined the Irish Constabulary, which later became the Royal Irish Constabulary, and was stationed in Galway. He had a grandson who came to prominence, Arthur Dominic Brew, died in 1912. He went down with the Titanic. And he sometimes spelled Brew with an extra E on the end. Burton Jr. was a doctor, and there was a great row when he married a Catholic, especially because the marriage was performed by Bishop Moriarty over in Kerry. He was a doctor stationed in Kerry, and I think it said something special. The bishop was related to his wife. That's why the Catholic bishop performed the marriage. So he became a convert to Catholicism. And John also had a brother, Burton. Burton is a well-known surname back in Carrigaholt because the Burtons owned Carrigaholt Castle for many generations. Burton Jackson was obviously closely associated with them because he called his eldest daughter Valentina Alicia, and Valentina and Alicia were the wives of 2 generations of the Carrigaholt Burtons. And this Burton Jackson was a trustee and otherwise mentioned in various deeds relating to the Carrigaholt Burtons over the years. And we're trying to figure out what was the connection between the Burtons and the Jacksons. We haven't found it yet. Anybody who can give us any help on that, we'd greatly welcome it. Our John, after he moved to Dublin in 1842, the following year, he married Mary Henrietta Sparrow. She was actually his first cousin. She had moved up from Wexford to Dublin. Their mothers were 2 sisters, both widowed quite young. So I'm not sure whether they would have known each other very well growing up with their widowed mothers living on opposite sides of the country, but they ended up marrying each other, and they had a single daughter, a couple of grandsons, and the grandsons went the wrong way. Both ended up in court, not as court reporters like their grandfather, but in the dock. And both died unmarried. So John Jackson has no descendants, which is one reason why he has been forgotten. But his brothers Burton and Benjamin do, I think, have living descendants. And he had an aunt, Henrietta. I'm almost certain she was his aunt because there was only one Jackson family in Kilrush. And she married Richard Rumley, who was a revenue officer or a customs officer here in Kilrush. He died in 1826, but they had 2 daughters, Alice and Henrietta, and they actually had a shop in the ground floor of Patterson's store on the square in the 1840s, until Henrietta married James Melville, who was a shopkeeper next door in what's now John O'Shea's, and he moved into the ground floor of Patterson's store. And they had 3 children, and then they moved down to Clonmel. So when the Melvilles went to Clonmel, that was probably the end of the Jackson family connection with Kilrush. And on the other side, if I go back to Rogers family, We've already seen Alice Rogers' descendants. She had several sisters who thankfully left us wills with loads of great family information. Her sister Deborah married Edward Sparrow, and most of the Sparrows ended up in Michigan, I think. But one daughter, Alicia Jane Sparrow, also became a poet or a poetess, whatever you called a female poet, in the 1850s, and some of her work has survived. So there was definitely a literary gene in the Rogers family, possibly rather than the Jackson family. And the last man of interest, another first cousin of John the writer, was Congreve Rogers. He was a wealthy landlord, sportsman who loved hunting, shooting, and fishing, etc., down in County Waterford. He was the subject of a lecture to a local history society down there a couple of years ago. He had quite a reputation. He's reputed to have lived to well over 100 years of age, but I found his baptism record and his death record, and he only made it to 91. And John Jackson's grandson was called Congreve Nolan, after his grandfather's first cousin, I suspect with the hope that this wealthy bachelor farmer would leave all his large estate to his first cousin twice removed, named after him. Unfortunately, Congreve Sr. didn't get the message and he died without a will. And I suspect the lawyers got most of the money, but Congreve Nolan, I don't think, got any of it. So that's a quick sketch of the Jackson family. Next question is, where did they live in Kilrush? And it's hard to tell because before Griffith's valuation in 1855, we don't have any maps linking occupiers to specific houses. But we know where John Jackson was on the night of the big wind, the 6th of January, 1839. He was in Kappa. He wrote this as Terry Driscoll, as his alter ego, in 1850, 11 years after the event. He was after putting up at Sam Lomas's inn at Kilrush, and Sam and myself were after turning the youngsters to bed when the hullabaloo beginned in the heavens. My hand to you, 'twasn't long till the slates thought fit to go on a voyage of discovery through the neighbours' windows. And Sam had hardly time to fasten a sealskin cap securely under his chin when he got a glimpse of the stars and the driving clouds through the vacancy left in the roof. Well, do you preserve, Mr. Lomas, having been a seafaring man in his youth, I up and asked his opinion. It's the tail end of a tornado, says he. So where was Lomas's inn? And what was Jackson doing staying in an inn in Kilrush? At this stage, he'd been writing for Limerick newspapers, and I wonder, had he moved his primary residence to Limerick? The problem is, you could write a book on Samuel Lomas and his hotels. In fact, Paul and myself have that book half written as well. He, for many years, owned property roughly where the Galleon is today, in that terrace of houses, in what we're pretty sure was known back in the early 1800s as the Square, or George's Square, or St. George's Square. Now, it wasn't a square. It was one side of a square, and the other three sides were planned but were never built. And in the middle of that square, you had what we now call Kappa House, and that was Patterson's Hotel. And Lomas, I think, may have been managing Patterson's Hotel. He may at another stage have had his own hotel near the Galleon, and he later had the Vandeleur Arms, which in his time was where the monastery is today, the Glynn residence. So we can't be 100% certain which of those three locations was the 1839 Sam Lomas's inn. Well, we know it wasn't the monastery because that wasn't built until 1841, but it could have been beside the Galleon, or it could have been Kappa House. And there's another mention after Jackson died. Lots of people said, wouldn't it be great if all his works were published together, all these weekly newspaper columns that he used to write that entertained people for so long? But nobody kept copies of them all. And it was reported that that plan was hatched in Lomas's Hotel in Kappa, not 3 doors from where Jackson then resided. So maybe he lived somewhere else in Kappa. Also, many years after he died, Nicholas Smith O'Gorman of Bellevue House, which Louis Keating and Maeve Howard have done up in recent years, wrote that Jackson did his writing in the back kitchen in Bellevue House. But what he was doing there, we're not certain either. We would love to know. Uncle Bob, as I called him, had these unmarried daughters who lived in Francis Street in this house. These are the pictures we put up with John Tierney, 2 doors down from the post office, the old post office building. It's no longer the post office on Francis Street. So I'm not sure who's in that house now, but that was definitely a Jackson house for many decades, because we have the Jacksons there from 1846 and Slater's directory up until they died in 1881. This is the other house. This is a blown up image of Stewart Street. This is the road out to the Wall Gardens and Killimer. This is the laneway down the back of Moore Street. And there's this fine big 2-story double pile house, by far the biggest house on Stewart Street. Was it a post office? But in 1855, in Griffith's valuation, it was where Alicia Chousdell lived. And her mother, Alice Jackson, formerly Alice Rogers, 4 years later in 1859, died at her daughter Mrs. Chousdell's house in Kilrush. So it is possible, because Richard Chousdell lived in Fort House, that Alicia, the daughter, had gone back to live with her mother, and this may have been the Jackson residence. But that's, again, a wild guess. We would love to have more information on exactly where they lived. So where did Jackson learn to be such a respected writer? I won't call him brilliant. I leave it to your judgment when you've heard a bit more how good a writer you think he was. There were a few editions of a directory of the poets of Ireland, and I actually came across William McNamara Downes long before I'd heard of John Jackson. But the Poets of Ireland lists both of them and says that they were schoolfellows in Kilrush. William McNamara Downes died 4 years before Jackson in 1853. He'd moved to America at that stage. He'd become a Young Irelander and is mentioned in some of the books on the Young Irelanders. And he's worthy of a talk or a book in his own right. But in one of his books of poems, which we found in the National Library in Dublin, he describes the academy and my preceptor, meaning the school where he went to, as the wood-surrounded dome where Alan dwelled. Who was Alan? Well, we know the local Church of Ireland curate in this church, or shared between here and Kilkee, was the Reverend Henry Allen. And we know that he kept a classical school in Kilrush, one of about 14 schools in Kilrush at the time. So it seems that the two writers, Downes and Jackson, were both Allen's pupils together somewhere in Kilrush. They both published most of their work anonymously or pseudonymously, and Downes published anthologies of poetry, including some of his own work, and I'm pretty sure some of Jackson's work. And in 1836, you're probably all familiar with the sinking of the Intrinsic in Kilkee. You may not have seen this painting by an artist called Beachy, depicting the ship in distress and all the Kilkee people on the rocks in the amphitheatre, I think, watching and wishing there was something they could do to help. And I like to think, well, it's probably not a direct depiction of all the people who were there, but John Jackson must have been there, because within a week of the sinking, the Limerick Chronicle published a poem called The Lady's Glove. Many of us have heard the legend of the Lady's Glove, and there's a debate about it. And Jackson also had this habit, when he wrote a poem or a short story, he'd stick 3 lines of somebody else's work in at the beginning. And Hemans was another lady poet at the time who was quite popular, but seems to have been forgotten. I'd never heard of her. So this is what he wrote. What relic hath fallen from yon wild bird, a bider by sounding sea? What relic by booming surges steered, and white as the billowy spray? Doth it speak aught of the perished there, gone down to their stormy graves? Bringeth it record of brave or fair, sleeping neath ocean's waves? A lady's glove, oh bear it hither, alas for the hand it pressed. Fair cheek hath blanched, fond heart hath withered, and bright eyes closed in rest. Of the cherished at many a hearth and home, there's left but this relic tossed, fragile and light as the deep sea's foam, a type of the loved and lost. Oh, when shall the voice of the mourner cease to wail in the far-off land for her who has left the vacant place and severed the kindred band, whose glove, like the dove-born branch of yore, is given for those that weep her, a pledge that the waters can chill her no more, that sweet is the rest of the sleeper. Kilrush, February 1836. So he's still living here in Kilrush. Some of you may have heard Deirdre Nolan's talk on the intrinsic, which she's given a few times in Kilkee and Shannon. And her argument is maybe there was a white glove picked out of the wreckage of the intrinsic, but some of the sailors wore white gloves for signaling purposes, and there may not have been a lady on board. But that poem was passed down in the oral tradition in Kilkee for 100 years, and it was collected in the school's folklore collection by a teacher's daughter, Corrie, I think was her name, from Tarman School, from her uncle at Calhan in Kilkee. And he said, I don't know who composed it, but it was word for word what had appeared in the newspapers 100 years earlier. So now we know who wrote it. So back to Kilrush. There were a few references to the Kilrush newsroom, and I wasn't sure what sort of newsroom might have been in Kilrush. When we think of a newsroom these days, we think of where the news is produced with computers and screens and all that sort of stuff. But in the early 1800s, a newsroom was where people went to consume news, to read the newspapers. People probably couldn't afford to buy the newspapers. So it was like a library. Today, people go to the library to read the newspapers or go to their gentleman's club to read the newspapers. And sometimes it was just called a reading room rather than a newsroom. And the first reading room here in Kilrush was set up by Father Matthew Corbett, then the parish priest of the joint parishes of Kilrush and Killimer in 1822. And the newspapers in those days were very much divided along political and religious lines. And Father Corbett tolerated both the Catholic and Nationalist and the Protestant and Unionist papers to be in the newsroom, until a couple of years later, a new paper called the Morning Register was launched. And it was designed to support the campaign for Catholic emancipation, which was at its height and which came to fruition 4 or 5 years later. And there was a schism among the members of the Kilrush reading room at the time. And the Morning Register, which had caused the schism by arriving on the scene with its very staunch Catholic views, blamed an orange miscreant. When I saw that first, I thought one of our conference speakers, we had to reschedule our planned conference next year because we were going to have it on the first weekend of September, and now we have the Irish Open Golf coming to West Clare that week. So we said there'll be no accommodation for genealogists. And we cursed what we might call an orange miscreant whose golf club is going to host that, but orange with a different meaning. Anyway, the orange miscreant in 1824 in Kilrush was the coroner, and that must have been John Lucas, who was the coroner from West Clare from 1820 to 1848. And the newsroom was described as the emporium of all the county politics and local gossip. And that's where the epitaph that I read earlier was written. And Charles Lever, I'm sure, joined that set of people when he came to Kilrush in 1832. His biography lists some of the people he hung out with in Kilrush. It says they actually met at their respective houses or at their cholera hospital. So maybe it's fanciful thinking that they met in the newsroom. Bobby Unthank was originally a Quaker from Limerick. He married a McNamara widow from near Fecal, and he made the news when he inherited a vast fortune from an uncle. And the Quakers challenged the uncle's will because he'd made a previous will leaving all his money to Quaker charities, and then he left it to a nephew who had left the Quakers. And at that stage, Bobby Unthank, like Jackson, moved to Dublin, where he and his widow died. Tompkins brew, I haven't been able to place. There were lots of Tompkins brews, but none quite fits the dates. John Jackson himself is on the list, Maurice Fitzgerald was an apothecary, a doctor associated with the cholera hospital. And John Lucas, our coroner, orange miscreant friend. And he's described in the report in Lever's biography as a descendant of Grattan's great contemporary. Charles Lucas was an MP in Grattan's Irish Parliament in the 18th century, originally from Ballingaddy up near Ennistimon, where Willie Daly, the matchmaker, is now. But John wasn't a descendant, he was a cousin of Charles Lucas. So, where did Jackson get his pseudonyms? His early poetry was written under the name Andy Marinan or anonymously. And a long time ago, I found a record of a real-life Catherine Marinan, married to John Cahill, in the Kilkee Catholic Parish Records, married on the 26th of February, 1838. That was the Monday before Shrove Tuesday. The tradition for Catholic marriages in those days was they all took place in Shrovetide, and most of them on the very last day of Shrovetide, Shrove Tuesday. But this marriage, or a variant of it, was reported in the Limerick Star, the paper for which Jackson was writing at the time. On Sunday, Mr. Patrick Cahill, not John, of Subathusa, County Clare. I've searched high up and low down, I can't find Subathusa. I think it's a fictitious place. To Mary, the daughter of Mr. Andy Marinan. Andy Marinan was John's pseudonym, and John Jackson was still a young single man at this stage and didn't have a daughter of marriageable age. Maybe the Catherine Marinan who got married was the daughter of a real Andy Marinan, and maybe that's where the pseudonym came from, but who knows? And then he throws the spanner in the works and says that the bride was the grandniece of Lord Lyndhurst. What Lord Lyndhurst, what any lord's grandniece would be doing in Kilkee, I don't know. But Lord Lyndhurst, with a D, was John Singleton Copley Jr. He was of Clare origins, but he was the second generation born in America, and he came back and became involved in politics in Britain. So I think this is a fictitious marriage report, and it has John Jackson's fingerprints all over it. Because 6 years earlier, 1832, the Limerick Chronicle announced a marriage in Kilrush of Alexander Elliot Esquire to Catherine, the eldest daughter of Robert Jackson of that town, Esquire. Alexander Elliot got married a year later to Harriet Cart. Catherine was still a spinster when she died in 1881. Now, maybe she stood him up at the altar and the notice had already gone into the newspaper, or maybe this is our friend Jackson up to more mischief. Another poem that was attributed by Terry Driscoll to Andy Marinan, as if they were two different people, they're just two different pseudonyms for the same man, was this one about Kilkee. There's lodging houses for themselves and spouses, where oft carouses the city swells, billiards and ball courts, and sports of all sorts, equal to Cheltenham or the great hot wells. But what charms the bather is the amphitheatre, scooped out by nature from the solid rock. Up 'tis there cowled punch is often drank, and lunch is tucked in by visitors at 3 o'clock. Jackson's main claim to fame is his reporting from the Petty Sessions Court. The courthouse back a couple of hundred yards in that direction. It was built here in 1830 to 31 when John Jackson was in his early 20s. It's still in regular use 2 centuries later. And he filed sketches that appeared in various newspapers under the simple heading Kilrush Petty Sessions. They began to be published in Limerick, and in those days there was what they called scissors and paste journalism. There were lots of small town newspapers and they copied articles from each other. It's a bit like social media where people share information that goes viral, but the Kilrush Petty Sessions report went viral in the newspapers all over the then United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and much further afield. Whether they were fact or fiction, I don't know. There's a thin line between comedy, humor, and satire on the one hand, and mockery, negative stereotyping, and racial, national, and sectarian bias on the other hand. And Jackson crossed that thin line sometimes. I think if he was alive today, he'd have been a stand-up comedian. And Richard has done an awful lot of analysis, literary analysis of that work. So in December, you'll be able to buy the book with that chapter by the three of us in it. That's the final proof that's now gone to the printers. And I'm not going to go into the details, but I will just read one sample. And thanks to Owen Shanahan, who sent me this recently, of a case at Kilrush Petty Sessions. A painstaking woman, a withered-looking old crone who might have sat for one of the weird sisters and whose every step in her progress towards the witness box was marked by an exclamation of bodily suffering, hobbled up, crutch in hand, and after half a dozen groans and as many, "I wish what's coming over us at alls," she proceeded to state that she was one Mrs. Horrigan, and that one Mrs. Cassidy, with whom she had lodged on the night previous, had given her such a heavy walloping she wouldn't forget it to her dying day. The usual query as to cause of action was put from the bench, and Mrs. Horrigan forthwith declared herself the possessor of more maladies, the result of said walloping, that was ever heard of in a country dispensary. "Oh, my lord," exclaimed Mrs. Horrigan, "the head of me is bursting with a pain that it split a rock asunder. And me two knees is trembling under me, so they are. And oh, murder, how the back is aching, not to mention a great wakeness entirely in both me ankles. And sure not asleep did I sleep those 10 nights with an oppression in me side and me heart, and all from the first I got from Mrs. Cassidy. The Lord forgive her and the Blessed Virgin." Mrs. Cassidy said, "She rode me out of a night's lodging money, your worship. I indeed came in as stiff with her God save all here, and ate her rasher and egg, and slept in her fine bed. But when I wanted payment in the morning, the Lord will reward you," says she, walking out of herself as cool as you please. Mrs. H now entered into details as lengthy and tedious as Dan's last to Ireland's only Jew. That's obviously Daniel O'Connell. Jackson didn't like Daniel O'Connell. The substance of which details were that she had eaten nothing worth speaking of and slept as little, that she had sung for the child, told stories for the whole family, and given the ungrateful Mrs. Cassidy herself the finest remedy for sprains in the shape of a small bottle of oil made from the stomach of a defunct man of colour, a sailor who was found in the beach near Seafield some months before. The magistrate said to Mrs. C, "Was she aware that you expected payment for your night's entertainment of her?" "Oh, blood alive, sir," returned the hostess. "To be sure she was. Isn't there entertainment for man and horse over our little door? And though she's neither one or the other, the old witch, we aren't bound to find her in food and sleep. Ara no. But if you heard her next morning, all the blarney she gave coming downstairs of her. 'Good morrow, Mrs. Cassidy. How are you this morning, ma'am?' she begins. And then she wiped the child's nose with respect to you. 'Oh, the little Gro McCree you are,' says she, cracking her old fingers in the crater's face. 'And the blessing of heaven be about this house,' says she. 'And a good morning to you, Mrs. Cassidy.' Sir, here's the blessed truth. I took her by the pole and sent her spinning out of the door, and off she walked, as stout as the Lord Mayor of Limerick." The magistrate said, "The case is dismissed." Mrs. Horrigan struck her crutch impatiently against the floor. Then, Mr. Magistrate," she growled, "don't treat an aged and ailing woman in this manner. Oh, murder, there's the pain again. Oh, I'm full sure it's a colic. Arra, blood alive, how the heart of me is panting. I know my death sickness is on me and the legs are failing me entirely, so they are." And here a policeman cut short her soliloquy and she walked off muttering maledictions on the whole family of the Cassidys. And he produced a piece like this after every court setting in Kilrush. Despite all his time in the courts, he didn't like attorneys. He wrote mostly about the witnesses, little about the lawyers and the magistrates. But this comes from George Unpeck McNamara's pedigree of the Daverans, as an aside, because Bob Jackson's wife was a Daveran. So apparently he wrote, when he saw a funeral of a lawyer, "There goes an attorney upon his last journey, the devil knows where. If all the fraternity went to eternity, the devil may care." He wrote longer stuff, short stories you'd call it. And after he died, his widow was in dire straits because he didn't leave her much in the way of money, but there was an organization called the Royal Literary Fund, and she had made an application to that, and she was required to prove that he was a distinguished writer, and she just mentioned 2 long pieces that he had written. One was St. Simon's Warning, A Legend of the Lower Shannon, published in 1842, around the time he was moving to Dublin, in the Dublin University magazine, and that is available online. So it's a long and convoluted tale. It's set on Scattery Island. John Jackson had gone out to Scattery Island, and he sat down with one of the islanders called Tom Crotty. John Mulqueen will tell me there were the Crotties, I thought, were one of the families that came after the Windsor Castle, which was after 1842. So maybe there were Crotties there beforehand, or maybe it's just coincidence that Crotties came there afterwards. And Jackson had his snuff box with him, and Tom Crotty saw the opportunity to get a share of the snuff box, and they sat taking snuff together. And Tom started telling tales, and one was the tale that Tom Crotty had heard from his father, Dan Crotty. And Dan had been in the cathedral, I think, on Scattery, while the artillerymen from the battery were playing handball. Last talk I gave here, there was a handball game involved as well, played in Tulleroe. But there was drink involved as well, and they appointed Dan Crotty to keep the score of the handball game, and they shared their drink, and he was a little the worse for wear, probably, and he fell asleep looking up at the stars. And the next thing he woke up, and there was a strange little man beside him and 2 wolfhounds. And he was forced down a hole into the underworld where he met this strange character. So I'll just read a little bit of that. Well, sir, to go back to me story, after Crusty Crotty took a few more go downs bigor, he began to feel quite at his ease. This is down in the underworld. What between the music and the hate, for there was a fire on that had roast an ox, and the drop of drink and the agreeability of the man of the house. Come, Dan, says the old chap, I'm a great admirer of our national pastimes. There's nothing like a little recreation sometimes when 'tis kept within due bounds. Come, we'll have to touch as a jig. Of course, me father wished to excuse himself, that he wasn't fit company for such doings, and had moreover nails in his shoes. Or he might as well be trying to soften a process server or a tax gatherer. No, come on, Dan, but up on the table with you, says the bucko. Oh, me dear life, excuse me, your worship, answered me father, I'd rather not. Saint Simon commands you, and I'm that individual, says the other, looking as serious as a doctor at a rich man's bedside. And a word in your ear, Mr. Crotty, you're mighty well off if that's all I require you, says he. And with that he took off his hat and swept every whole pence worth off the table, and up they both hopped on it. Perhaps you have a favourite tune, said Saint Simon. You can't puzzle my performers. Uck, my lord, your holiness, plays yourself for goodness sake, says me father. So with that, the other made a sign to the pipers, be rubbing the forefinger again the palm of his other hand, and I'll engage they understood him at once, though being dark of an eye apiece, and struck up the razor strap. The people of the island used to count Dan Crotty a remarkable good foot on the floor, but he often acknowledged himself that he couldn't hold a candle to the saint. It was amazing how his feet used to go, though being in top boots, and if he showed off one step, he did 500. When they were at it till the drops of perspiration, with respects to you, were coursing down one another down me father's face, they got down off the table and took another drop to rest him after the exercise. Indeed, they wanted it. Not to flatter your holiness, says me father, your dancing master may be proud of you. So a weird little story, but certainly something of significance in Kilrush that should not be forgotten. So Paul was going to talk about John's time in Dublin. I'll just give a very brief outline of that. It's going to be less on the screen about this because I was hoping Paul would have it prepared. I mentioned Gerald Griffin, and his mother was one of the Geary family, and the Geary family had newspapers in Limerick under various titles. They changed the title every few years. It started out as the Limerick Evening Post, then the Limerick Evening Post and the Clare Sentinel. Was that because they hired a Clare man, John Jackson, to write for them, I wonder? Then it went to being the Limerick Star and the Evening Post in 1834, and often you just see it referred to as the Limerick Star. So it's essentially the one paper produced by the one family. Maybe they were running away from libel actions or something, which forced them to repeatedly change the title. But by 1835, Jackson had fallen out with the Gearys, and he transferred to the Limerick Chronicle, which was a much more conservative Protestant paper, and continued publishing the identical Kilrush Petty Session stories in the Chronicle for several more years. In 1842, he moved to Dublin. Whether that was to do with his romance with his first cousin, who he married in Dublin the following year, I don't know. But he had started to send his articles to the Morning Herald, which was a London newspaper, and he proved popular in London, and the Herald headhunted him as their Irish correspondent, and he now had a steady salary of 150 guineas a year. And he was sent to cover Daniel O'Connell's mass meetings. Daniel O'Connell at this stage was running the repeal movement to try and repeal the Act of Union and gain Irish independence again. Jackson was against repeal, and O'Connell had these mass meetings in Tara and other places with up to 100,000 people, I think, attended some of them. So the newspaper sent people to report on them and try and take down what O'Connell was saying in his speeches. And that was Jackson's job for the Morning Herald. And at the end of 1843, the government authorities launched a treason case against Daniel O'Connell and his son and several other of the leaders of the repeal movement. So there was this massive trial in Dublin early in 1844, attempting to prove O'Connell guilty of treason for what he had said at the mass meetings. So the state needed a witness who had been there and had taken good notes. And the Morning Herald sent Jackson's reports to the government, and he was asked to confirm that they were his reports and that they were a truthful account of what happened at the mass meetings. And he was cross-examined by lawyers for O'Connell and torn to shreds on the basis that he had been publishing embellished versions of the truth or pure falsehoods from the Kilrush Petty Sessions courts for many years in the newspapers. But O'Connell and the other defendants were eventually convicted and sentenced to jail. They were released after a few months, but Jackson lost his job at the Morning Herald at this stage. But because he had turned government evidence, he got a cushy number as a clerk in Dublin Castle. He'd been on 150 guineas a year with the newspaper. He was on 150 pounds a year in Dublin Castle. So he got a 5% pay cut as a result of it. So it's at this stage that he turns from Andy Marinan into Terry Driscoll. And Sheridan Fanu at this stage owned a newspaper in Dublin called The Warder. There were loads of newspapers in Ireland in those days. And Terry Driscoll had a weekly column in The Warder for the last 13 years of his life. He wrote these weekly letters from Stoneybatter to a Mr. O'Donoghue in London. You've seen the style of some of them, in similar style and language to his Kilrush Petty Sessions reports. Some of them were headed Ireland and the Irish. And I read something the other day where he was accused of coining the phrase Ireland for the Irish, which is a quite different phrase, which has been used by some of our less welcoming countrymen these days, I think. His last column appeared only a few days before he died. He had a fascination with pipers and piping that comes up in a lot of his writings. And by a weird coincidence, his last piece was on the death of a famous piper called Gansey, who lived down in Killarney, who was known throughout the world. And a week later, Jackson's own obituary was being written. He had one daughter, so she was only barely a teenager at that stage. So widow and daughter, despite the £150 a year, he seems to have had TB or something and had large medical bills in the last years of his life, and the wife and daughter were left with almost nothing. So all his friends got together and raised two collections, one for the support of his family and one to pay Kirk for a monument to be placed over his grave. And there were subscribers like the Vandelers and the Burtons in West Clare. The writers like Fanu and Lever contributed. Griffin would have contributed, except he was dead already. Hundreds and hundreds of names sent in contributions. His widow lived on for many years, and died in relative poverty, I think, in Dublin. His daughter married into a Catholic family and had these two sons, one who worked in the post office and got in trouble for absconding with the funds, I think, and the other went to visit relatives of his mother's in Leeson Park in Dublin, and they were out at church at the time, and the maid left him in the dining room, and eventually he got fed up of waiting. The sermon must have been very long that Sunday or whatever, and he said, "I'm going now." And when the old ladies came back, the family silver was gone. So young Mr. Nolan ended up being prosecuted for stealing from his cousins, and there was some sort of plea bargain, and he was allowed to emigrate to Canada, and he died in Canada, a relatively young man as well. So that was the end of the Jackson lineage, and the writings were never collected and republished. And I suppose because we now have newspaper archives online, they're much easier to find than they would have been for the last 100 years. And I think we should remember Jackson, and hopefully this talk and our forthcoming book will remember him a little bit more. So apologies from Paul that he's not here to give the second half and that it was short and sketchy, but I hope you're entertained and you'll want to read more of Jackson and that you'll buy the books when they come out. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you very much for listening. And can I have somebody to take the roving mic around if anyone wants to ask a question, so that those listening to us on YouTube can hear? And meanwhile, I will switch over here to YouTube and see if there are any questions from our online audience.
Paddy, you mentioned that you found the reading room.
We found newspaper articles about the reading room. We didn't find the location.
Okay, that was my question. Sorry.
That was the question. We may find it yet. As I said to Paul, some guy called O'Brien wrote a great book on the Glynn family, and he mentioned all sorts of institutions in Kilrush. There must be something in that in the reading room, but I don't think he came across anything in the reading room in those days. Wait for the mic, Finbar, please.
The Wallace family have a vault down near the wall back at the old church.
Which family?
The Wallaces.
The Wallaces.
Yeah.
What are the Wallaces? Did I mention Wallaces?
They're the same Wallace out in this road there.
Yeah, but what have they to do with Jackson?
No, but they'd be neighbours, like, you'd be very close to them.
Here in the graveyard?
Here in the graveyard, down at the wall there. They have a vault there.
Have we any questions? Hearing you loud and clear. All is well. Yes, we're hearing you. Great talk, and I look forward to the book. No questions. Any other questions here in the room? Michael.
Paddy, the style of language, the way it was written in English, was that common, or was it his own style, the spelling and that he used?
Oh, I think it was very much his own style, but it reminds me of Flann O'Brien or Russell Carroll Kelly. So there may have been others writing in a similar style at the time.
Well, there doesn't seem to be any more speakers from here, but I can, on behalf of us all, Paddy, to say thank you. You've opened up another page for us, another thing to look forward to, and the book will be another Christmas present for us all, I'm sure. So thank you, and on behalf of us all here, let's give him a vote of thanks.